Thanks everybody so much for joining. We are thrilled to kick off the second round of Spark's Open Access 101 series. My name is Nick Shockey, Spark's Associate Executive Director, and it's been wonderful to see so much interest in this second round and from the first round of these that we did last year, really focused on providing sort of a broad foundation of doing open access work in libraries. And it's been wonderful to see a similar level of interest in these deeper dives into specific topics. We were organizing these, to provide a complement to that first series that was really meant to provide more of an entry point into open access work in libraries or refresher for those that are already doing this work. And these next three will be deeper dives into a few higher priority topics, specifically visibility and impact in that intersection with open access that we will cover today, as well as two more events coming up next month and the month following on problematizing predatory publishing and authors' rights. And at some point, we'll get links to those events in the chat in case anybody needs to register for those. We're really fortunate to have experts in each of these areas join us for these events to share their knowledge and to help guide the conversation around each of these, I should say, the speakers and their pets. Both fortunate to have both. Fortunately, don't have one, Josh, but it looks like you're in the office, so maybe no
Uh,
luck either. They're like a plant that you can bring into the frame.
I'll grab it before the end of the session.
Kidding. Um, yeah, and so anyway, thrilled to have expert speakers to help lead these 90-minute conversations. We're also really fortunate to have fantastic collaborators in Josh Bullock, Maria Bond, and Will Cross to once again help organize this series the second time around. Josh, Maria, and Will's edited book, Scholarly Communication, Librarianship, and Open Knowledge, continues to be a really important reference and resource for so many folks. And in many ways, I think our series in its evolution, sort of follows their model of, bringing in those really doing this work directly to share their experience and their expertise, as was the case with scholarly communications, like scholarly communication librarianship and open knowledge. And also just want to take a second to recognize all of the amazing contributors to that book, many of whom I imagine might be on the webcast with us today. So as we kick off today's session, I would love to invite folks just to briefly introduce yourself in the chat with your name, institution, location, whatever feels most appropriate. And it would be wonderful for folks to stay active in the chat throughout the session. It always helps to liven these sessions and make them more interactive and allow us to sort of tailor the conversation and whatever directions folks are most interested in, or to surface other experiences that folks have, since I'm positive there are many folks joining today that can also give presentations on open access, impact, and visibility. So I'd love you to share that experience as well. And honestly, even just like reactions are great and can be helpful encouragement for folks stepping up in front of a large group like this to share in the chat or coming off of mute to ask a question during the Q&A. For questions, specifically, we'd ask that you do use the Q&A functionality on Zoom. That will just help us facilitate Q&A a little bit easier. It also will allow you to upvote questions that others have asked, or even comment and respond to questions live as well. We'll catch the ones that go by in the chat, but the ones in the Q&A, we can guarantee we won't miss. Then finally, just a reminder that we are recording today's session, so just be aware of that, particularly if you're coming off of mute to ask a question during the Q&A. So with that, I will extend my thanks to Rachel for joining us as our expert speaker today, and we'll turn it over to Josh to give a little bit more of an intro on today's topic specifically, and to introduce Rachel Borchardt from American University as our presenter and facilitator. Josh, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nick and Spark, and thank you all for being here. It's like Nick said, it's encouraging to see the interest. We're really happy to continue this series that we got a lot of great feedback from in the fall, but this time because we wanted to dig into some deeper topics, and we don't presume ourselves to be the experts on all of those topics, we were excited to collaborate with others and kind of put these topical experts in front of you and give them space to share their knowledge and information. So Rachel's talking with us today about the relationship of open access with visibility and impact. Teresa Schultz and Matt Ruin will be talking about sort of challenging the conventional narrative about predatory publishing, and Dave Hansen from the Authors Alliance will be talking about open access and its relationship with authors' rights. That's May 14th and June 6th, if I recall. With that, well, I think I'm carrying the torch for my collaborators, Will and Maria, today, but they are here in spirit, if not in person. They had conflicts, so I think we're not going to be able to make it, but you'll see them in subsequent sessions. So I'm very happy to welcome Rachel Borchardt, who is the Scholarly Communication Librarian at American University, where she oversees open access and open education initiatives, manages the institutional repository, and supports research impact efforts. She holds undergraduate degrees in neuroscience and psychology from Oberlin College and earned her MLIS with a concentration in medical librarianship from the University of Pittsburgh. Rachel's professional and research interests lie in developing equitable models of research dissemination and evaluation, including the use of qualitative and quantitative metrics that challenge traditional power structures in scholarly publishing and the academy. She co-authored Meaningful Metrics, a 21st Century Librarian's Guide to Bibliometrics, Altmetrics, and Research Impact, openly published by ACRL in 2015, as well as other works on these topics, and chaired the ACRL task force that produced the Framework for Impactful Scholarship and Metrics in 2020. She has a husband, 2 children, a cat who has charmingly been making an appearance. Penny, I gather, is the cat's name, and a dog, and enjoys swimming, tea, and pinball. And Rachel, I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. So please join me in welcoming Rachel. And it's over to you, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Penny is probably going to be a distraction throughout, but I've got my iced tea ready. So this is going to be a quick 90 minutes. I will try to stick to time as much as possible. We've got a lot to cover. So we're going to start with just some foundational concepts. I see we've got a lot of specialization from many people that are attending here, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, then we'll start looking at some of these intersections between those foundational concepts: open access and research impact, open access and visibility. Through some of these, we'll start talking about visibility and then bring in open access later, open access and researcher incentives, and then how we contextualize open access and impact for researchers, and then pull it all together with a couple of final thoughts. So diving right into our foundational concepts, starting with research impact. Research impact does not always mean the same thing to everybody, so I think this is important to talk about. Traditionally, when you talk about research impact, what that has meant is actually just scholarly impact that is most commonly measured using bibliometrics or citation-based measures. So how is your scholarship impacting other scholars in the field or otherwise? This is most heavily associated with those STEM disciplines, but is increasingly used in many different contexts and disciplines, for better or worse. So some of those main bibliometrics include citations, as well as journal-level metrics, journal impact factor, SJR, site score, et cetera, as well as author-level metrics with H-index and various other variants of the H-index that have accumulated over time. However, a more recent definition of research impact is the total research impact that the research or the researchers had on the world, which is only ever partially measurable. And I really want to stress that, because it means that we are building stories that will always be necessarily incomplete. So this expands our impact potential beyond scholars to many different potential audiences, and it places a much higher value on the process and engagement with research, with researchers, and with those audiences, rather than just a more narrow focus on the impact of scholarly publications solely. This also includes a blend of measurements, which we'll only partially cover today. So talking about open access, again, just to make sure we're on the same page, I think many people that are attending the call will be familiar with the basic categories of open access. We have gold open access, hybrid, platinum, diamond, and bronze. I'm not even going to cover them in the interest of time, but it's, I think, useful to at least talk about different ways in which open access is made available. So all those first four are journal level designations, though obviously open access exists outside of journal articles. Penny's back. But there's other ways to make open access available, including uploading in repository. That includes green OA most commonly, but there is also gray and white forms of open access where the scholarship is never going to go through a peer review process associated with the journal article and just lives on the repository either as an earlier version or as a standalone product. And finally, the one that librarians don't always like to talk about, but I've seen referred to as black OA, but does bear relevance to today's conversation, is essentially making copyrighted material available online, even though you do not have the permission to do so. So Sci-Hub being one of the most common versions of it. But anytime a researcher or someone else is uploading their copyrighted material that they don't own the copyright for. All right, so let's dive into open access and research impact. So usually when people talk about open access and research impact, the first thing that comes up is OACA. I don't know if anyone calls it OACA, but I say OACA, or the Open Access Citation Advantage. There are many studies, and this is really the best studied and researched area between open access and research impact. But there's always the question, does it really exist? I actually noticed that one of the authors is on this chat. Hi, Amy. Published a great systematic review in 2021 that I think is a much better look at the intricacies of being able to give a definitive yes or no. So those research studies, that study found that of what they studied, about half of what they found did associate a positive correlation between open access and a citation advantage. And another quarter of them found that association for some subgroup of what was studied. More commonly, it was associated with social sciences, medical and health sciences, as well as natural sciences. And overall, they did not find a relationship between different types of OA and that citation advantage. That said, there are literally hundreds of studies on this. So as you can imagine, what is actually true can be difficult to discern and really depends on what it is you're measuring, how you're measuring it, and how you're defining these concepts. That said, I wanted to take a look at a couple of other studies that relate different types of OA because I think they both make a similar and interesting point. So these are just two snippets from those studies that are cited here. But what I wanted to point out in this case is that the green part of each of these graphs is higher or on top, meaning both of these fairly large studies found that of the different types of OA, despite the systematic review overall not finding an overall correlation between OA type, these two studies did find that green open access was more impactful or increased your citation advantage more, again, more overall relative citations than any other type of open access impact. So that's an interesting point and one that isn't necessarily intuitive to everyone who's thinking about this concept. So that's at the article level, but there are some studies also trying to determine whether there's a journal level OACA, right? Do open access journals overall receive more citations? There was a study that showed that a journal who has flipped from a subscription model to gold OA, yes, does show that open access citation advantage. But overall, there's a lot of different ways that a journal can become gold OA, and they look very different from each other. So I think when we're looking at establishing that overall connection, what kind of journal it is, who it comes from, what the reputation of that journal is plays a large role. When we think of really large gold OA publishers like Frontiers and MDPI versus, say, the big 5 academic publishers, it's going to look pretty different. And just to mention that perceptions of OA are still very common and play a role, right? Whether people think that open access is a negative connotation and that term predatory still gets used an awful lot. We'll see a study later that talks a little bit more about that. But if you want to learn more about predatory publishing, as Josh and Nick were highlighting earlier, there's another Spark webinar happening in mid-May to talk more about predatory publishing. All right, so that's really the scholarly impact. But if we harken back to our 2 definitions of research impact, once we start looking at the broader impact beyond scholarly realms, this really opens up a lot of new possibilities for looking at the role open access plays in broader research impact. Other words for broader impact are public impact or societal impact, but includes a lot of different overlapping but potentially distinct subgroups. And you can see some of them listed here. This is important because it helps define how we might start to measure them. So when you are measuring broader research impact, as I mentioned, it's going to be a mix of qualitative and quantitative indicators. And ideally, what you have is some initial metrics that talk about intention or engagement paired with later indicators of change or impact that's going to be more qualitative in nature. That said, there's not going to be any one formula by which you're going to, I can tell any researcher how to measure this broad impact. It really depends on the audiences, the works produced, and the metrics that are available, as well as the measures. But total impact, when we're looking at this broader definition, can arise both from original scholarship, so journal articles, other things usually with the DOI, as well as translated research. I put an asterisk there because that may be a term that is unfamiliar to many of you. So what is translated research? This is essentially taking original research or research findings and either summarizing them or applying them for a different audience. So some examples include, actually in the New York Times today, someone from my university is talking about a press release. So those are two, it's like twice translated. The press release came from the original research, and then you have the news media citing the press release. But there's many different ways in which this could look, and note that towards the bottom is where we start to see some of the more applied things where, say, a company isn't necessarily citing research, but they're using the research findings to inform their own practice. So the connection that I want to make, and I'll talk a little bit more about why I made this and when, I suppose, is that open access is really a passive form of research translation. By making research open, you broaden the potential impacts because there are many people who want to use the direct results of research rather than translated research to cite, such as in policy and news, that they want to incorporate into their practice, especially practitioners and community research partners, as well as for general learning purposes. And we'll see some data to back me up a bit. But it all starts with making the original publication open access rather than turning it into translated research. So it's really a complementary practice in order to achieve broader impact. There are a couple of great frameworks. This is really a more new emerging concept. We have bibliometrics, many studies over many years to really define and narrow critique bibliometrics. When it comes to broader impact, there's not a whole lot that covers the full span. So I'm just going to highlight two. One of the best ones, I think, comes from the UK, the Research Excellence Framework, which is a countrywide model. So anyone who's attending from the UK will be more familiar with this ref because every institution has to demonstrate their broader impact. So there are broad frameworks to match that broadness. And you can see that they have 8 impact categories that were included in the 2021 version that nicely line up to some of those subgroups that we talked about for broader impact. One other one that is a little bit more popular in the United States that I've heard about is the Boyer model. This originated from a 1990 scholarship report from Ernst Boyer called Scholarship Reconsidered, where he took 4 broad categories of impact, which are here: scholarship of discovery, scholarship of integration, scholarship of sharing knowledge, which is also known as scholarship of teaching and learning, or SOTL, and application of knowledge. This is a very broad framework under which a lot of different types of impact can be situated, but note that the application of knowledge speaks to a lot of the broader impact in those audiences that we talked about. I mention this because, as we'll see later on, people do sometimes use this for measurements of research, particularly in the United States. So some evidence that some of those specific subgroups do actually use open access. So this is good in a theoretical sense, right? That open access can facilitate broader impact. But we do have evidence that it does, in fact, play a role. Starting with policymakers, and I will say this, none of these topics are as well studied as the open access citation advantage. But if you know of additional studies or evidence, feel free to drop it in the chat. That's why I love that this is open for everyone to contribute, so it's not just me with all the knowledge. There were Canadian policymakers that were interviewed about 20 years ago, but they said that they relied heavily on open access research in order to inform their policymaking, which I believe is the only time I could find that they were directly asked. Overton, which is a database that collects policies and then the citations, usually to DOIs and published research that are found within those policy papers. And they did find that a higher percentage of open access papers versus closed papers are cited within policy overall. A separate study found that open access study status increased the likelihood of being cited in policy, so very similar to that last. But they actually found that being cited in media was kind of the intermediary, which suggests that policymakers may be directly accessing research, but they also may be finding out about it initially from those translated research efforts in media and news, and then making their way back to the original policy. Moving to another group, we just talked about news and media, and Teresa Schultz, who was actually one of the speakers for the predatory publishing, has done some work looking at journalists and their views and perceptions and use of open access in 2 separate studies. So I pulled these directly from her studies. The one on top is showing that about half of all news that gets cited within a news article that she studied came from Gold OA, and another quarter from Green or Hybrid, with only 23% being closed. As you can imagine, these are groups that don't necessarily have extensive access to research, so that this all makes sense, right? But it's good to have some actual studies to point to. On the bottom, the question was asked of news scientists, science journalists. There we go, I switched the words. Where do you go to get inspiration for your news articles that you're writing? And you can see the #1 response was from directly news articles and journals, followed by press releases. So a bit of a disconnect there between the previous study, which found that policymakers are using news, whereas the newsmakers, at least in this study, are reporting that they start with scholarly articles rather than a translated research output coming from the university in the form of a press release. Or maybe those are complementary. And then a nice quote that I saw from a science journalist, directly stating the importance that it's important for an academic article to be as quickly and easily accessed as possible. If I can't access it for free through open access, I may not have the time to go to the trouble of tracking it down. So it really does facilitate this translated research and facilitates broader access. Now moving to the more general public use of open access, we have a couple of studies. There are many more, but again, I don't have time to cover everything, so we're just kind of hitting some highlights here. This was a study of going back to that REF framework. In 2021 UK, they cited lots of different websites as forms of broader impact. And what they did was just study what types of citations and what types of websites were being cited. And essentially, you can see that there's a lot of broader impact happening across different disciplines and a lot of different types of different websites. So this is just kind of showing you that research does tend to make its way through different venues for lots of different disciplines, and it's not STEM focused. But the breakdown between disciplines can be super interesting. Another study from Amit Doshi, who is here as well. Hi, thank you for sharing your research with me. This was presented at the ACRL conference, but as part of his dissertation. Harvard has an institutional repository and has an institutional open access policy, so has lots of original research through Green OA in its repository. On the cover page, whenever you download material, it asks you something about how are you using this? How has this impacted you? Please let us know. So Amit analyzed about 1,500 of those responses to get an idea of who is using Green OA specifically. And as you can see on the left-hand side, there's a lot of different categories, from professional use to personal use, government use, and then some of them were just writing to say thanks, as you can see along the bottom. But within those broader categories, we see a really wide array of use that is reflected in those earlier slides as well. So overall, we're seeing Lots of people use these for lots of different purposes. One specific category that I hadn't thought of that Amit talked about was citizen scientists, or people who have developed expertise in an academic field but don't necessarily have official training, but still like to keep up. So they may not have university affiliation, but still are interested in direct access to literature. Whew. So that was your whirlwind tour of different ways in which open access and research impact intersect. And now we're going to talk more about visibility and how open access relates to that. So there's a lot of different ways that research becomes more visible. And I started trying to write out different methods, and I thought, okay, this is kind of too much. And then I thought it would be helpful to summarize some primary methods. So I differentiated between two different dimensions. One, again, whether it's original research or translated research, are we tracking based on DOIs of journal articles or other original outputs? Or are we looking at something that is a translation, a summary of that research? And was it created by the authors themselves? Was it created by somebody else? So you can see there's a fair amount of overlap. For example, in social media, we can share, right? All of these original research can get shared, translated research gets shared, both by the author and by third parties, just depending on the case. But some of these are more specific. For example, a university press release is usually going to directly quote original research, but they're packaging that information usually for news so that it can get picked up and translated further, as we saw a couple slides ago with the journalists and where they're getting their information from. Some other things that I think are important to note is that translated research can also start to include not necessarily direct translations of a specific research study, but also the expertise of a researcher, right? So as we start to break away from original research, we're looking more at people rather than translated research outputs, which we start to see on the lower half. So it is people that are giving presentations, that are doing advocacy works, that are giving interviews, that are being hosted on podcasts. They may or may not talk about individual research studies, or they may talk about summarized findings that cover the whole span of their work. But I think it's important to differentiate, because when you have actual written outputs, you've got a DOI and you can track them. When it starts to get to expert, it's a little harder to track. And that's where you start to maybe lose some of those connections between the directly measurable, citable, and those greater impacts down the line. The role of the researchers is pretty significant in some cases. All right, so looking at some specific visibility platforms, I did talk about social media, and I know that people are always interested. Myself, as a librarian, where should I be? So we have one slide just to talk about visibility for academic social media specifically. That said, there are not a ton of studies, as you might guess, because this is a very fluid question. Where people are on social media and how to interact is ever changing. But I wanted to isolate two specific platforms, Blue Sky and Twitter, because there have been some recent results that people essentially are starting or have significantly moved from one to the other, and are using it in different ways currently. So the pie charts up at the top, just from last month, we're measuring, this is from Altmetric, who now tracks Blue Sky, and that's something that only began in March. What kind of content is being shared on Blue Sky versus X/Twitter. And they found that in Blue Sky, there's a lot more original research rather than reposted research. So that's a decent indication that you're getting more of that academic conversation rather than maybe third parties that are starting to spread translated research outputs. And on the bottom, in January, Nature did a poll, about 5,300 people responded, just asking about X use, and over half of them said they used to, but they have left the platform. So two pretty significant indicators that the academic conversation, Blue Sky is one of those places that people are shifting to or have shifted to. Please note that there are other platforms such as Mastodon, Threads. I just haven't seen good studies. If you guys know about some additional indicators of where social academics are on social media, drop them in the chat. Again, I'm not the only one with knowledge here. There we go. Turning to academic social network sites. These are a separate category. This is not generic social media, but sites that have been created specifically for the sharing of academic works. So they function a little like social media and a little like a repository. Google Scholar, ResearchGate, and academia.edu are three prominent examples. There's a really good comparison from 2021. I encourage you, if you want to look more in depth as to the different strengths and weaknesses of each one. I was just trying to figure out how many people are on these, which is really tough. ResearchGate, according to this study from 2021, 17 million. Academia.edu, 71 million. Google Scholar, unknown. That said, is that really representative of how many people are active users of these different platforms? Unlikely, but that's the best I could find. And in terms of the kinds of metrics that you can expect to get, they all have some kinds of metrics, though in the case of Google Scholar, you're going to get more traditional bibliometrics, whereas ResearchGate has really built a more robust platform around giving not only number of views and downloads per article, but giving you a score called the RG score, the ResearchGate score. The importance of that score in describing someone's impact or broader impact is definitely debatable. Some people consider it to be a legitimate impact metric that you might use to describe your research impact as a researcher, and many others question that. And I'm just going to leave it there because I don't think I want to give a definitive pronouncement. Yeah. So coming back to impact, there is a 2016 study that looked at academia.edu and resulting OACA, or Open Access Citation Advantage. In this case, consider and keep in mind, we'll talk about in a later slide, that we are not guaranteeing that this is a legitimate form of open access. However, when people upload materials to academia.edu, this 2016 study found that across every discipline that it was associated with the citation advantage. So it does seem that ASNS, academic social network sites, do also help with that citation advantage as well. Now, this is the question that I found myself wondering. Why are academic sites so popular with researchers, right? Millions of users. And anyone who manages a repository, as I do, or tries to promote open access and uploading of accepted manuscripts into a repository, feel as though every single accepted manuscript that ends up in a repository is a huge win. There was a study that looked at least in the case of why are academic social network sites so popular, and found a few reasons why. One, they're highly visible, right? These are for-profit companies that are behind this, so they have a lot more SEO advantage to make them highly visible through search sites like Google. It takes relatively little effort. That once you create a profile, it's going to ask you to start uploading materials. And third, and I think perhaps the most critical for librarians specifically, they demonstrated a huge preference for uploading the published version of research. So this is where the Black OA comes into play, that they don't have to really worry too much about whether they have necessary permissions to download something. It's happening anyway. So as librarians, if we want to start pushing against the popularity, or at least promoting green open access, that we may need to educate people further on the benefits of green open access and some of the unique things that we can get from green OA that are not necessarily available with ASNS. But I think it's good for everyone to know that these alternatives exist and that they should be taken seriously, because it is something that many researchers are considering as part of their strategy for making their research available. And finally, LinkedIn. I felt like I needed to include this slide just because it's something that people talk about, but it's not exactly social media. It's not exactly an academic social network. Again, I had difficulty figuring out how many academics are on LinkedIn and use it actively. There was one study about 11 years ago. Well, they reported it. I don't know where the information came from, that there were 1.9 million people on LinkedIn. But there was a study that found that while it does seem to be relatively ubiquitous, and there are certainly people who are talking more about using it as a social network or social media networking site, that it seems to focus more on researcher visibility rather than research visibility. And there is a preprint that suggests that it's academics who are trying to reach out to specific applied forms of research, such as industry and private sector engagement, that are associated with greater LinkedIn use. So my general conclusion is that increases the visibility of those expert researchers, but not necessarily used as a primary site for uploading research, though it does absolutely happen. It is just not built as an ASMS for the sole purpose of sharing those research materials. All right, we're about halfway through. Congratulations, everyone. We're gonna keep chugging along so we have lots of time for question and answers and discussion. So let's talk a little bit about how researchers are incentivized to create open access or publish open access. So there's a few things that both intrinsically and extrinsically motivate researchers to adopt open access. From the extrinsic motivators, we have mandates. So they have to publish open access and it is not a choice, or it is tied to times at which the researcher is being evaluated on their research impact. There are also intrinsic motivators, such as appealing to their greater values of information equity, or other values that it may be tied to their personal research. And I would love to take a big deep dive into when open access researchers publish studies behind paywalls, but we'll avoid that for today. Or just cultural norms. Everyone else is doing it and it's the practice for a specific subgroup or field. We're gonna focus on those external motivators because one, there's more research on them. Two, I think they have a much greater ability to move the scale than intrinsic motivators, though we certainly can debate that. So we're talking about mandates. Some different types of mandates exist, including at the national level, as well as private research funders in addition to governmental research funders, as well as institutions, universities, colleges, or even individual schools or departments that are creating their own mandates. So we're going to look first at national mandates, starting with the biggest and arguably the most successful, Coalition S. So this is a network, that is primarily countrywide initiatives within the EU, but also does include private funders. They have published Plan S, which, as anyone who follows open access closely knows, has been a major initiative around adopting or change in open access. Most notably, for many years, they were pro gold OA, but have recently backed off of that statement. Anyway, it is good to know that in the EU, many countries operate under a countrywide mandate and have aligned with some prominent private funders, Gates Foundation and Wellcome Trust being two of the most well-known ones that are very active in the open access sphere, to mandate that anytime you publish associated with either that funded research or that country, depending on the mandate, that you must publish open access. Looking at two countries in North America, with apologies to anyone attending here from Mexico, and I'm sure that there are people from elsewhere in the world on this call, so my apologies for perhaps overly limiting our worldview. But in the interest of time, I'm sure many of you are aware that there is also legislation in both countries. Canadians, I am not Canadian, so if I got any part of this wrong, please put something better in the chat. As far as I can tell, there is currently drafted legislation that's under review that would mandate OA for funded research beginning in 2026. And most notably, with all Canadian researchers encouraged to abide by the mandate, even if they are not funded by Canadian research funds. In the United States, as I'm sure many Americans are aware, currently we have the Holdren memo, where the large government agencies, if you are funded by them, you must produce open access results within 12 months. The 2022 OSTP memo, or the Nelson memo, removed both the embargo and the restriction to 100 million, asking all agencies to come up with plans to introduce no embargo OA for all funded research. That, as of now, is still on the books to go into effect in 2026. Again, if I got this wrong, since OA legislation is more a Spark thing and less a me thing, please sound off in the chat. But overall, it's good to know there is legislation in both countries. Around the world, there are many mandates that exist. So moving less from the national mandate to more institution specific. RoarMap is one place that tracks these mandates. As you can see in the graph on the left-hand side, the vast majority of them were adopted by specific research organizations. And as the chart on the right will show you, primarily, again, from Europe. So we're seeing a lot of alignment between things like Coalition S and resulting mandates, even though they're also perhaps covered by a separate national mandate. And they can be slightly different in nature, but usually complementary to each other. There is a separate rights retention tracker, a Simmons wiki that specifically tracks open access rights retention policies. I have it on direct authority from Peter Suber. That's right, I got an email from Peter Suber. He tells me that this is the more up-to-date version of the tracker. However, if you compare the numbers, you'll see that one, the countries don't align in terms of prevalence, and two, the numbers overall are very different, where we had about 1,100 initiatives versus the US having almost 80. Different types of mandates is one big reason, but I think also I suspect neither of these is fully complete. So they're the best guesses that we have as to the kind of mandates that exist currently. All right, so moving from mandates to the other extrinsic motivator, research evaluation. There are multiple times when researchers are assessed based on the sum of their research and asked to provide evidence of their research impact. Some of the most notable include when they are hired for a position that includes research responsibilities, when their initial contract is up for renewal, when they're evaluated for grant funding, or at the end of a grant when they have to show broader impacts or any impacts of the research that was funded. What we're going to focus on today, and why that is the only highlighted one, is promotion and tenure, as well as rank. So when someone within their institution is seeking tenure or promotion. There is evidence that tenure promotion really weighs heavily on many researchers. One study found that education faculty surveyed said that overall promotion and tenure was the #1 consideration when they were deciding whether to publish open access or not. That said, other factors came into play. Again, we see reputation as another avenue, right? So not just any open access journal being one of the considerations, as well as things like impact factor, is I assume what we mean by impact here. What I think is really interesting and something that I would hope everyone will walk away with when thinking about promotion and tenure, because we are going to talk about how promotion and tenure can facilitate open access, that it is not just policy that moves the needle. And this, is, again, is coming from these education faculty. They said that both policy and culture, right, of their department, or more specifically, the senior members of their department who will be weighing in on their file, as well as other administrators, usually on their campus or externally, is an important factor for thinking about whether to publish open access. Okay. So how is open access incorporated into tenure and promotion documentation? There are already examples of this happening, and some broad categories about how it is introduced. One is through the broader concept of open science. The second is through this broader societal or public impact that we talked about, or it's explicitly named on its own without explicitly tying to these other two concepts. I'm not going to say that this is necessarily all of the different venues, but these seem to be the themes that I have seen emerge. So some specific examples for you, because I think it's important to say, and we'll talk about it at the end, it's good to know that people are actually doing this and cite examples. So one is the University of Maryland. This was very publicly announced and talked about. Their psychology department revised their guidelines in 2022. You can go to that website directly to see what it covers. I tried to highlight the relevant parts here. But you can see that they talked about procedures and criteria should recognize value and difficulty, doing work with a couple of other things, and or approaches to open science. So explicitly mentioning open science as something that needs to be taken into account. And that procedures should recognize the multitude of research products that people produce as part of their research program. So really not focusing just on journal articles or scholarly outputs, but other materials that are part of open science, such as data sets, research tools, software, etc. Another example that we have from Belgium, the University of Ghent, who is also known as one of the leaders when it comes to revision of their tenure and promotion guidelines. And again, they have a whole website on how they focus on open science at the university. So again, I tried to highlight the relevant parts, but the focus on open science coincides with the movement away from essentially the research impact definitions that we talked about. So moving from scholarly impact to broader societal or public impact. And I particularly like this one because this is one of the only ones that ties those two concepts together. Moving from open science to that broader impact, we have Boise State, who has implemented the Boyer model. We talked about the Boyer model earlier. In this case, they produced a pretty interesting matrix that is shown here. I'm not sure if I fully understand it, but essentially is saying that the application of Boyer model in different forms of scholarship and different types of engagement can show different types of impact that they value. It is a pretty involved website. So if you are a university who has ever mentioned the Boyer model or looking for inspirations for those who have fully integrated the Boyer model in a very thoughtful way, and I should mention they talk about it not just in a scholarly context, but it also has informing both teaching and research as well. I highly recommend that you take a look at this website. That said, it does not explicitly mention open access, but again, these kinds of guidelines facilitate and make it easier for researchers to describe how open access aligns with these guidelines. And finally, a very personal one coming out of ACRL that I helped create, but I love, so I wanted to share. So this is not a university-specific model, but one for our profession, for those of you who are academic librarians, specifically in the United States. So this is giving a framework not for a broader impact of every audience, but in this case, what we chose to do was to highlight different ways to measure impact for scholarship, so citation-based and more traditional forms of metrics, as well as more applied or practitioner-based metrics. So it takes a wide variety of different scholarly outputs and describes how you could contextualize different measures and metrics to describe both scholarly and practitioner impact. That said, it even says in there that it is not explicitly covering open access. But again, when we talk about those broader impact goals, it is very easy to tie open access publications to the facilitation, in this case, of reaching those practitioner audiences, such as public librarians who may not have access to these materials. And we can also find examples of open access just existing in promotion and tenure guidelines as is. That said, I would say this is relatively rarer, and there is usually some underlying purpose or higher values that are being expressed, even if they aren't explicitly named here. These examples both come from my university because they were very easy for me to find. So we have one from the School of Public Affairs that is acknowledging the role of disseminating research using non-traditional outlets that are open source, electronic, or similarly accessible to practitioners and the general public. So I guess you could make the case that they are tying to that broader impact, that they don't necessarily make that super explicit, as well as other open practices. So this again is a bit of a nod to open science, but they are not scientists. So it's really just more the broader goals of making more research outputs openly available. On the bottom, guidelines from my own department that we are encouraged to adopt open research practices, and then listing a bunch of them, including open access publication. I did want to highlight that these don't stand, like the universities themselves aren't the only things that you can point to. And what I'm trying to get at with all of this and why I'm spending so much time is going to be covered in our next section, which is how do we actually deliver really compelling bits to faculty to encourage them. One of the things that we tend to hear is we're the only ones doing this. No one else is talking about this. This isn't the way it's done in my discipline. So these are all meant to push back on that, what can be a misassumption. There are many movements that are discussing not necessarily open access, but open science, or changes that need to happen to make our research impact broader and more widely encompassing. Center for Open Science is really the only one that I picked that is more open science focused. More Than Our Rank is something that I didn't cover in this presentation, but they're focused more on university rankings, which of course is another way that traditional forms of research impact tend to be reinforced. So it's a coordinated push to try and move away from that through the REF, which is used to create university rankings in the UK. We have DORA, which is really about responsible research assessment and not over-reliance or overuse of bibliometrics. Q-metrics, which is more of a values-based proposition of ensuring that we're valuing what measuring what matters to us. These next two are run by Pew, who are people who fund a lot of research. They bring together two different groups of people. One are grant funders, and one are institutions who are interested in the topic of transforming evidence, or how do we better deliver research results to broader audiences. And finally, PTI, Promotion and Tenure in Innovation and Entrepreneurship. This is a little bit more focused. Remember when we talked about the different categories of impact, this is definitely along the economic, industrial impact, or something that's called tech transfer, where we're taking research and applying it in an industry or business. But they have quite a good framework for that, for describing how promotion and tenure should cover those case uses to encourage more of that type of application of research. All right, and we're going to close things out with just looking at, almost close things out, looking at a couple of specific examples of ways that I myself have contextualized open access and research impact for researchers, because there are many different ways to do this, and a lot of it really just depends on where your institution is and what they care about. So at my institution, we recently got a large grant, and we have not yet been canceled. It is called the Accelerating Research Translation Grant. It's run through the NSF, and this is a big reason why I included research translation as part of our conversation today. It is focused on the integration of societal and economic impact and research translation at American University. I became involved initially because I heard about it, and I wrote up a one-pager asking for funds to hire a staff member to support IR processing with the goal of a institution-wide open access policy. That didn't happen, but they kept me as part of the research team anyway. And my goal, or my role on that team, is to advance open access as a form of passive research translation, and with my research impact expertise to also talk about the role of metrics and alt metrics in broader research impact discussions. Where we are currently, we are creating a new strategic plan. We have a fairly new president who created committees. One of them is the Research Distinctiveness Committee. And as part of the committee's goal, it talks explicitly about developing public impact for the next 5 years. So I am fortunate to be on that committee, helping to lead that work. So that's the context for American University. We are very much talking about public and societal impact as well as economic impact right now. So this is a presentation with one of the other people that is on that research grant, measuring and increasing societal impact. And This are two slides that I put as part of that larger context. So the context is research impact, but within that context, we can talk about open access and using many of the examples that we've talked about already, deliver those messages straight to the researchers. Additionally, talking about how our institutional repository specifically can help facilitate this by giving you a DOI, by increasing the trackability, giving you alt metrics, et cetera, in my case. And as it happened, the researchers actually had a lot of questions about open access, even though this wasn't the primary purpose. Most of the Q&A was taken up with this. However, I will say in the past when we used to hold, open access workshops, we had very low attendance. So another example that I helped work on, this is at George Mason University in Virginia. They, I would say, look much more like a traditional STEM-focused campus. So they have a lot of biotechnology, engineering are big focuses at George Mason. So when you talk about research impact, usually what people are more interested in are citation counts, journal impact factor, et cetera. That said, they wanted to help promote open access on campus and thought to do so by hosting workshops on open access and research impact. They asked me in because they don't have a research impact librarian. So I was brought in to talk about those bibliometrics, talk a bit about societal impact, and then one of their librarians came in to talk about how open access helps facilitate research impact. So just a couple of slides from here, you can see the goals, which we already talked about. So traditional impact, societal impact, a little bit, just to get them used to the idea, and then talking about open access. So in this case, the context for open access and research impact did not talk about those broader impacts. It focused specifically on the open access citation advantage, using specific studies to drive home that point. So as you can see, different approaches, because if we had started coming in and talking about broader impact, everyone would go, this isn't relevant to me, where this is more directly relevant. I get more citations and my bibliometrics go up because of open access. So my final thoughts before we open this up for discussion. So some tips on how to communicate open access to your stakeholders. In my opinion, having someone with research impact expertise greatly facilitates these discussions. As I hope I have implicitly shared, researchers care an awful lot about research impact because it is very important to them, promotion and tenure being one of those important times. And contextualizing open access under research impact can be far more effective. So having someone to help lead those conversations who is known for impact rather than open access can be one route to do so. That said, when you are working with individual faculty, say who need to work on a promotion and tenure file, that you can talk about open access in the context of both impact and visibility, right? And start to make those connections between what is in their promotion and tenure guidelines and how open access can help facilitate that. Ideally, this is something that you are giving to, say, someone who is new to campus, like incoming tenure track faculty, rather than someone who is 6 years into things and already has a bunch of publications. Institutional change, like promotion and tenure guideline revisions, should align with your campus priorities. I think I've talked about that enough. But coming back to those education faculty who talked about having a policy is not enough. If people don't believe in it and are willing to accept it when they're actually evaluating your file, and that is really a cultural element. If there is one thing I have learned from supporting research impact on my campus for about 13 years, culture is equally important to policy, and policy cannot be successfully reinforced without institutional buy-in. Finally, as I mentioned before, this isn't happening in isolation, and I think the more often that you can show researchers at your institution that they are part of broader changes that are happening, they will not be the first to adopt open access or to take advantage of it for scholarly impact, for broader impact, the more successful your messaging will be. And with that, I am going to stop talking since it's been quite a while, and that leaves us plenty of time for discussion.
Hi again, everyone. And Rachel, I feel so confirmed that we asked you to do this because you're so fluent and like have all of this so readily available to you. And I'm envious of that because I think I could tell a much more compelling story in my own outreach, and I imagine that many of my peers on the call share that. But like you've packaged that all together, so I feel like you've given us a resource in the slides that we could use to update our knowledge. Like mine has been feeling a little dated, and so like thank you. There's several comments in the chat calling this a wonderful talk and incredibly informative, and I absolutely agree. So. Please do, I see a couple questions are starting to populate the Q&A. I will I'll be turning to those, and so please do keep dropping those in. We are going to go as long as conversation goes, up to the half hour. So we have about 27 minutes. Totally understand if folks need to leave, but I'm going to do my best to continue monitoring the chat. But like Nick said, it's really helpful if you put your questions in the Q&A. I'm just looking at notes that I made while questions are starting to come in. There, Rachel, there was a comment or a question that was made in the fall in the previous version of the series where someone asked, like, what will happen to the OA citation advantage when everything is OA? And I saw a presentation, I think in the interim, by the CloudSource OA folks, where they speculated, or I can't remember if it was their study or if they were citing a study, but they speculated that functionally all journal literature would be open by 2040, which struck me as a pretty ambitious timeline, but that was based on the trajectory so far and kind of, projecting out. And so like, that's within the time frame of our careers. I think, I don't know how old you are. It's in the time frame of my career. So that question was posed, like, what will it mean for the OA citation advantage when functionally everything is OA? And my friend Will Cross at the time said, I believe, quote, don't threaten me with a good time. But I wonder if you just like have a response, or like if that's something you want to kind of play with while
Sure.
questions
Yeah,
are
I mean, I think this is more conjecture than anything, so this is just my own personal take, but I would definitely push back on the idea that everything is open access. I think that what we have seen is a slow movement of the things that the publishers are gaining less from subscription fees for. The ones where it makes financial sense, where it is less risky, to move from subscription to an open access form. And with subscribe to open, we're definitely see that happening in real time right now with publishers making those calculations. How much will my bottom line change? So I think how much publishers expect to make, how much profit they expect to make and want to maintain is a big part of this conversation. So I would definitely push back on the assumption that it's all going to be 2040. I think that you will see some values aligned publishers doing that, and I sure hope we see more of that. But I think some of the biggest for-profits who maintain large, parts of their revenue through subscriptions, through really popular and really prestigious journals, are not going to be particularly willing or ready to switch to a fully open model anytime soon. They're seeing plenty of revenue from a hybrid model. So that is what I kind of see as happening, is some portion of literature will be made fully open and another portion of literature will be hybrid. That is what I envision as a more likely future by 2040. But we'll see. There may come a tipping point when publishers just give it up and move to some other revenue model that's more solely focused on open access, in which case APCs are probably going to. Anyway, in this hypothetical world where everything is open, part of the reason I wanted to talk about different strategies for openness is because it does matter, right? And when we talked about, is there a goal or a journal wide OACA, that's where we start to see it really matters what journal you're talking about. And so I think that will continue. I don't think that all research is just going to magically get a bump, that I think more prestigious outlets, bigger publishers are still going to get a disproportionate share of open access citation advantages.
Yeah, that sounds right. Thank you. So the questions in the Q&A, one from Karen: have studies been conducted on the research impact of plain language summaries, which are published along with abstracts in research papers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have not looked for that exact case use because I've never thought of it. So I love that you're asking that. But if anyone knows of any, absolutely put them in the chat. That said, I have seen articles talking about a citation advantage for titles of articles, that ones that use more plain language, and especially ones that use declarative models, then followed by questioning. So three different kinds of titles: one describing the what your research is about; the second kind is asking a question about your research; and the third one is declaring the results of your research, essentially. And they said the one that does the declarative statement receives more citations. So based on that, I think it's reasonable to assume that plain language summaries that are included, like on the first page of results, something that's near the abstract, something that is readily available to researchers, is likely associated with a citation advantage. Is it associated with a broader impact advantage? I think probably not as heavily, because you're relying more on translated research at that point. So is it appearing in press? Is it appearing in media? More than does it have a plain language summary with no other ways to access that information?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Julia says, so much of the conversation focuses around the disciplines that science, STEM, medicine, those that like to count things, citations, grants, etc. Has there been much work in talking to humanities disciplines? And I guess you might speak to your own experience at American, or if you're aware of broader discussions there.
Yes. So I should say American University is a social science heavy, so it's easier for me to talk about social science, which has been more involved in talking about ways to describe impact beyond metrics, bibliometrics, for quite a long time. And I think that in some ways is even more true in the humanities. Humanities does not have a really rich history of using metrics. They have a qualitative history, right? If you think about monographs and the book review, that kind of forms the basis of how we historically think about scholarly impact in the humanities. So it shouldn't surprise anybody that they're more comfortable having these more ambiguous measures of impact, and really understand public impact, societal impact, and how open access facilitates that a bit more. That said, again, with the monographs, the open access conversation is a bit different there. So I think it is more difficult, especially when it comes to green OA, right? We are not going to be encouraging, say a history scholar to be open access green OA publishing anytime soon. Maybe their preface, but not the whole book. But those would be more about, larger conversations about how do we make monographs open access? How can we join those movements? Can we prioritize that in tenure and promotion, or recognize that it does facilitate getting this work, this qualitative information, in the hands of greater people? So yes, I think there are conversations to be had, and I probably should have focused more on that. They just can look differently, and that's part of the whole contextualizing this information, not just for different institutions, but for different.
Yeah, in my experience, some of the barriers are higher for humanities researchers, but the interest is there, at least like if they're familiar. So my wife is obviously familiar with open access because she's married to me, and like I talk about it. But she was unrelated to that, as far as I know. Her most recent book, she's a literature scholar, and her most recent book, her was SUNY Press. Her editor contacted her and asked if she was interested in have it being included in the JSTOR Path to Open program, so becoming open 3 years after publication. And she was thrilled at that. And I think we're about a year from that coming true. And I've talked to other humanities researchers that like they'd love to be able to make their work, including their books, open, but they're the barriers and challenges, and like those are tricky, and so some of them have been able to achieve that, and others have not been. And then there's folks that like maybe haven't been evangelized to as much, and so are maybe not as aware of why they would want that. Kyle says, are there any efforts to suss out whether and how researchers might be reducing their visibility due to risks associated with their research topics, or perhaps concerns they might have of being targeted due to their research area or their personal identity?
You know, I don't have anything other than anecdotal data for that. I think this is probably too new of a topic, at least in the United States. It's possible that there are some international works that talk more about censorship associated with research or being targeted. It's more of a relatively new phenomenon that people have genuine fears about it to the degree that they're getting expressed related to open access. Overall, I would say, at least at my institution, I mentioned I did the university open-wide open access mandate. I did a bunch of talks with a bunch of faculty as part of that. I don't want to make this about that, but I had one researcher out of maybe 100, 120 that expressed that concern. So she and I talked about, specific strategies. And what I said to her was that research translation is actually a really good opportunity where you might want to make the original results behind a paywall, but then contextualizing it for specific audiences so that you are targeting groups that want to hear your messaging without exposing yourself to other groups that may be targeting you. So if you're working with, say, disadvantaged youth, right, that you are creating maybe a pamphlet or, something that, I don't know, probably a TikTok, something that would speak to those youth and putting it in a platform where they can access that information without everyone being like, oh, I want to target you because you're trying to help these people or something like that. So that was my advice to her as a good intermediary between making all of your research open or protecting it all for the sake of your own safety.
Yeah. Yeah. In my interactions, like I always prioritize the concerns of the researcher. Like it's their work and their risk. And so like they need to be really like recognized front and center for that and in the driving seat. I do sort of, I mean, we've been talking about how there's an OA citation advantage and like visibility impacts. So open works have a broader reach. However, I don't like, I think if you research and publish on controversial topics, I'm not sure that you're really shielding yourself that much if you're publishing on it, right? Like, I mean, headlines do so much of the work because they're attention grabbing, right? So like that, but again, that's something that would defer to the researcher, and be supportive of their decision. Alexander says, you brought up research on whether the open access citation advantage is real or not. Is there any research on whether researchers themselves believe the OA citation advantage is real? I'm wondering if there's a disconnect between expectations and reality in that regard.
Fascinating question that I did not look at. I would be a little surprised if people had asked people, just because it's a bit of a niche topic. But I would, again, open this up to anyone who's still here who, if you know of any studies, put them in the chat. But I am not aware of any. What I have encountered more is people not being aware or not having specifics about the fact that not all open access is equal, right? And that things like reputation still play a role, translated research still plays a role, in terms of broader impact. But it's not necessarily just I make it open, I receive more citations, that there's more nuance. That is where I see more of a room for conversation. Yeah, I've never heard someone say that they didn't think there was an inherent connection.
Yeah. I mean, like a lot of times when I presented on that, people sort of accept it on face value, especially if you can show them a couple studies. I mean, in reality, it's more complicated, but like it sort of makes sense that all else being equal, which it's not, but all else being equal, more widely available research is more likely to be consumed. I'm going to skip one and circle back to it because I think it's rich for sort of everyone to chime in on in the chat. So anonymous attendee, I'm coming right back to your question. But Tara says, because AI wants to read all the things and may be blocked by paywalled content, do you think that too will drive more open access publishing or have an opposite effect? And I know that all of us are kind of chewing on like, what does AI mean for fill in the blank, but also openness. So I'm interested,
Yeah.
Rachel, what do you think?
Yeah, I wouldn't say this is necessarily my specific, area of expertise, but I actually was thinking about bringing it up when we were talking about protecting researchers, because that's another thing, that came up in talking with faculty. If I make it open access, won't that mean that it's more scrapable, right? And the answer is yes, but if someone wants that information, putting it behind a paywall is not a guarantee either. That we are seeing large publishers making very big deals with or without the researcher's consent.
Yeah.
So the way I see things heading is they will grab as much research as they can. Yes, open access will facilitate that and should, but that doesn't make it enough of a negative to say don't publish open, because it honestly, unless academia or publishers make a really big concerted effort against this in the form of legislation or something else, I don't see that changing. I think it's just a byproduct.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, to date, I think basically the entire internet, both public and private, has been scraped, and like that cat's out of the bag. But it'll be interesting how legislation and lawsuits kind of make their way through, and what the impact those have. And like I suspect, if the determination across the board or like at large scale is that training LLMs models without permission is not fair use, then we will just see more of publishers, like you were pointing out, making big deals that authors, for the most part, don't benefit from. So an anonymous attendee says, this has been the most elucidating webinar I've watched on the subject, so kudos for that. And do you have any advice for someone brand new to the field? And like, I guess we could take that in a number of different directions. Is that research impact itself, or scholarly communication and open access work more broadly, where research impact is like such a portion of it? So Rachel, on the impact piece, I think your 2015 book, I mean, some things I imagine, like if you were to do a second edition, I imagine there could be some pretty significant updates, but I suspect that would be a pretty strong foundation. Slides here link to lots of studies, and I think being aware of the literature is always going to be compelling to researchers in telling the story. What other resources come to mind on research impact if someone is like developing skills and knowledge so that they can be more effective on their campus?
Yeah, 5 years ago, I would have immediately said Twitter,
Right.
as that was so helpful to me as an early career librarian trying to learn more. And, there have been some articles published by research impact librarians really talking specifically about how frustrating it is that all of these topics are not ones that early career librarians usually have much knowledge of, access to. And so it's difficult to break into. And this is a conversation I have with people on a semi-regular basis who want to talk about how I got involved as a scholarly communication librarian. And I was not for many years. I was a science librarian and just kind of picked it up because it was talked about in science. I think conferences are a great way. The frustration being that there is no one like open access research impact conference to get all this knowledge. So it really is, when I was asked to do this, it really started to occur to me that we tend to have these two conversations separately, but not often together. So I don't know if I have great advice other than talking to other librarians and figuring out, what do you do? Where do you go? What are your go-to resources? Because I don't think there are any centralized, if everyone goes here, and gets the basics. There's things like Juice Academy and other places that have kind of basic boot camps for some basic level knowledge. But other than that, it's however you keep up with the profession at large tends to result in hearing bits and pieces about various aspects of this along the way. Things like this webinar today. I really don't.
That's exactly right. Like I was thinking that too, like anonymous attendee, you are here. And Spark hosts things like this that, like, this is building on that previous series. The recordings are available on Spark's site. There's the forthcoming sessions. They do lots of things that Josh, Will, and Maria have nothing to do with, and I show up to those to learn. There are other communities that touch on aspects of these conversations and like sort of tying all the pieces together. The book that Nick mentioned in the intro that Will and Maria and I co-edited and co-wrote a piece of. A few people were really kind in the chat mentioning that. It is freely available. I put a link to it in the chat, Scholarly Communication, Librarianship, and Open Knowledge. That is scoped at an introductory level to help people. Like that's overtly the way we thought about it, is like a lot of people are coming into these roles or transitioning into them without a ton of background, and like it being an opportunity to sort of a hook to hang your hat on and start to wrap your head around. So we were speaking to you, and there are nearly 80 contributors to it, some of whom are on the call today, like Nick mentioned, and all of whom were excellent. And I think that's really the strength of the book. Like, lest it sound like I am plugging and bragging about my own work, I am proud of it, but a huge portion of what I'm proud of is the nearly 80 experts who lended their voice and knowledge to it. So that's a free resource with tons of citations. The Scholarly Communication Notebook is a companion to it. I will grab a link to that because that has some resources though. I'd have to look. It's been a minute since I looked at it, and I'm not sure what content is there that directly speaks to research impact.
I think the last thing that I would say is when in doubt, prioritize librarian perspectives. That publishers can have very different reasons for wanting to share information about open access. Some are operating in good faith, and not all of them are. And some of the most highly visible forms of communication when it comes to open access are ultimately kind of publisher controlled. I don't want to name names here, but take those with a grain of salt.
That's actually where the author's rights session, that's the third in this new series, comes from, is that there was a recent webinar about that was very from a certain perspective, and we wanted to sort of balance that a little bit. Tons of expertise in the chat. So folks, if there are resources that you've used to build knowledge at that sort of introductory level, please feel free to share and plug your own work or the work of your colleagues that you found helpful. There's a link to the Scholarly Communication Notebook. So that's worth poking around in. What other? Andrew, like I saw you in the chat and got some responses on this as well, but working on an OER manual for students and protective licenses. I mean, I think to some extent the CC licenses can be protective licenses, right? Like there are the non-commercial license protects against commercial use, and if you are the rights holder, you retain the right to pursue commercial use on your own because you own the copyright. The no derivatives license doesn't permit derivatives in the eyes of many that wouldn't meet the definition of an OER because the community has really focused on the revisability and reusability as core to what we mean when we say something is open in the context of OER. others may have other additional perspective and want to chime in.
I mean, I think it's worth talking about what specific uses you're protecting from, because I think that will really inform the path that you take. And, I think with this talk about AI, I think there is a lot of like fear right now that's warring with these kind of broader principles of let's make everything available for the betterment of research. And I think the more that you listen to that, the easier it can be to kind of buy into these larger values of, not everyone, 100% of people are necessarily going to use my research in good faith, but that doesn't mean that I should let those case uses outweigh the greater good. That's where I tend to fall down. But I think, thinking about what are those fears, right? What are you afraid might happen, and what are the reasonable steps I can take to try and protect? I think non-commercial can often cover many of those. If you're afraid that someone's going to take that manual and then sell it to your students, a non-commercial license gives you at least, the power to take legal action. But, at the end of the day, just like with AI, if someone really wants to do something bad with that information, there's not much that you can do outside of legal action that is 100% going to protect you unless you never make it available to anyone anywhere.
Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, so we're winding down to a couple minutes. There's more appreciation in the chat. Thank you to everyone who attended. Thank you especially to Rachel. Excellent masterclass on research impact. I would love, I was like, I want, you need to come to KU and talk to my faculty and administrators, but maybe I can skill up enough to approximate your knowledge level or pretend. Thank you. Nick mentioned that when you close this window, a chat is going to auto-populate. We would love your a survey will auto-populate. We would love your input. We read every comment and it helps us think about how to do these better and what future topics. So please respond to that. And thanks everybody. Appreciate your time and hope to see you in a couple weeks for the next session. I think it's May 14th. Problematizing predatory publishing with Teresa Schultz and Matt Ruin. Good to see everybody.